being committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces, we have since then seen an increasing number of allegations of human rights abuses by Tigrayan forces, as well as continued reported violations by Ethiopian and Eritrean defense forces. It is vital that all parties heed the repeated calls to end hostilities and seek a lasting ceasefire. As ever, there is an urgent need for a serious, inclusive dialogue with a genuine intention on all sides to reduce tensions, avoid more civilian suffering, and find peaceful solutions. Leaders on all sides must refrain from spreading and should indeed actively counter messages of hatred and incitement to violence on the basis of ethnicity. We embarked on this joint investigation at the invitation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to enable our teams to get first-hand information on the facts, to allow us to provide a faithful account of the situation in Tigray, and to assist in ensuring accountability. The report is not an exhaustive record of all violations and abuses that occur during the conflict, but it fairly illustrates the main types and overall patterns of violations and abuses. And I'm grateful to the many victims and witnesses who shared their experience and to others who provided pertinent information. Their voices speak in the pages of this report. I want to amplify here today what victims and survivors of violations convey to our joint investigation team. They want their means of livelihoods restored. They want reparations for destroyed homes and all they have lost. They want to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones, for all sides to acknowledge their role in the suffering they have inflicted on them, and for the perpetrators to be brought to justice. The government of Ethiopia has assured us that national institutions have begun investigations and prosecutions, with some perpetrators already reportedly convicted and sentenced. There is, however, a troubling lack of transparency, so we are concerned that investigations and proceedings conducted by Ethiopian national institutions do not match the scope and breadth of the violations we have identified. A key concern of our report is due accountability. National authorities have the primary responsibility to deliver fair and independent proceedings that address the full range of violations identified rather than isolated individual instances. If national authorities are not in position to do so, an international independent investigative mechanism should be considered. Building on this joint report, such a mechanism could then take steps to undertake criminal investigations and gather and analyze evidence of the full range of violations and abuses that can be directly used in competent criminal courts, whether at national, regional, or international levels. It is crucial that the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea ensure that those responsible for serious human rights violations are held accountable, regardless of the affiliation of the perpetrators. I will now pass the floor to the chief of our Africa branch, Marit Kohonen Sheriff, who can brief you on the methodology and challenges faced in the course of this investigation. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Good morning to you all. Let me talk to you briefly through the objectives and the reasons behind the joint investigation, the methodology we used, and the challenges that we faced. The specific overall objectives of the investigation were comprehensively to investigate violations of international law, provide accurate account of abuses and violations in Tigray, identify atrocity crimes and other serious violations with a view to provide included the harassment and intimidation of the joint investigation team members by regional security forces, especially in Western and Southern Tigray, the perceptions of mistrust of the UN in Western Tigray and in Amhara-administered areas, as well as perceptions of bias against the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in some parts of Tigray. Operational constraints included the communication shutdown in the Tigray region, the failure to date by government to release satellite phones procured for the investigation, difficulty in obtaining necessary security clearances and guarantees for travel, owing often to the dynamic security situation on the ground, insufficient vehicles, and other reasons. The lack of engagement by or the written responses from some parties to the conflict to the joint investigations team's questions also presented a challenge. There were other challenges encountered in interviewing victims of sexual violence, including the lack of medical records, family pressures, stigma. But nonetheless, we're confident that the joint investigation team was able, through the interviews it conducted, to collect a significant amount of information establishing patterns of sexual and gender-based violence. Of course, and you will understand that a joint investigation between an international human rights organization and a national human rights institution is a complex endeavor. It presents unique challenges due to the different structures, reporting arrangement, but also in this particularly complicated conflict. Social media, both within and outside Ethiopia, was replete with negative criticisms and propaganda, which is believed to have contributed to the hostility registered at least in 4 locations where the investigation was conducted. But despite these constraints, and while the report, as the High Commissioner said, is not an exhaustive record of relevant incidents, the joint team was able to collect and corroborate a significant body of information. And based on these facts, we have been able to assess patterns of violations and abuses. We hope the report serves not only to amplify the voices of the victims, but also as a step towards further investigations and raises the alarm on gross violations and abuses that have been committed in the course of the conflict and serves to prevent further atrocities from being committed. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to hand the floor over to Françoise Mianda. She's the chief of the Africa section covering East and Southern Africa. Over to you, Françoise.
Thank you, Marit, and thanks, High Commissioner. Good morning. I would like to thank you for this opportunity. Our last intervention will be related to victims. And as you know, they've been the raison d'etre of this joint undertaking. The joint investigation enabled us, Marit said that, to get really valuable first-hand information about the situation on the ground. Colleagues were able to visit different parts of Tigray, and they were able to see from themselves the impact of shelling on houses, on schools, on hospitals, on churches, which were either have been targeted, subject to indiscriminate attacks, or were used as military facilities. As you know, thousands of civilians have been displaced, and access to social services severely reduced. The team had important opportunities to speak with victims and witnesses of violations and to convey their lived experience of the impact of this terrible conflict. Through their voices, we see how every violation and abuse against one individual has a serious reverberating impact on entire families and communities. For example, the team spoke to one woman whose daughter died, and she was crying, saying that her daughter left her alone to raise the 2 sons behind. Victims of unlawful killings were disproportionately male, as they were more likely to be subjected to affiliation with an opposing party to the conflict. They were also more likely to actually engage in hostilities. So the targeted killing of men left many women behind, and they became single parents. For example, a 19-year-old survivor told how she and her 15-year-old sister were gang raped over a month because their father and brother, they were fighting for the Tigrayan forces. Other women told how they were raped in front of their children. Some of these women have not received any medical care physical or psychological. Victims and families of abduction, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances suffered different forms of torture and ill treatment, including psychological trauma from not knowing the whereabouts of their beloved ones. And the conflict, as you know, also worsened the situation of thousands of Eritrean refugees who were already in Tigray. Many were killed. Thousands have been left in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The internet and phone shutdowns also restricted access to information. Families were unable to know the status of their loved ones. And in the words of one witness, it has turned my life upside down. Due to appropriation of food and crops, entire families were exposed to serious risk of hunger and had to rely on other community members and humanitarian assistance in order to survive. In several villages, following the looting of health centers, civilians lost their access to basic health care. What we have seen since the end of the investigation is, unfortunately, the intensification of the conflict, which increases suffering of civilians caught in the middle. So we hope that hearing this first-hand account of victims and witnesses will really galvanize all sides and the international community to ensure that the fighting stops. Because at the end of the day, it's about the lives, it's about the integrity, it's about fundamental rights of all Ethiopians, be they from Tigray, from Afar, from Oromo, from Amara, and so forth. And maybe just as the High Commissioner pointed out earlier, I would like to again say that victims and survivors of violations, they told the Joint Investigation Team that they want restoration of their means of livelihood. They want reparation. They are seeking for the truth about what happened to their loved ones. From all sides, they want all sides to really acknowledge responsibility of what has happened and what is happening, and for perpetrators to be brought to justice. So in conclusion, I would like to say that this report should not be viewed as a stumbling block, but rather as a stepping stone for accountability. We've heard the voices of victims. It is now urgent to put an end to the suffering and move towards accountability. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. Now, if we can take the questions in groups of three. I see we have 3 online questions and 1 in the room. So 2 in the room. So let's mix them up. So first, perhaps, hand up was Laurent Sierro of the Swiss News Agency, ATS. Laurent, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Rupert. Thank you for taking my question. Have you established a confidential list of individual perpetrators, as it is the case in some circumstances that could be used by a potential triple IM? And in any case, can you tell us whether high-ranking military officials are responsible of some of these violations? Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Jamie, I think you were the first hand up in the room. Jamie Keaton of Associated Press. We can hear you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jamie from Associated Press. I actually have 2 little questions. One is, which armed group committed most of the abuses? And if you can't say so, then please explain why. And the second question is something we just got in from the Ethiopian government, which has responded to the report saying that it is, quote, clearly established the claim of genocide as false and utterly lacking of any factual basis. Is that true? Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. And the third question, John Zarakostas, France 24, English service.
Yes, Good morning, High Commissioner. I was wondering if you could celebrate the situation. You had one of your officers expelled from Ethiopia. They're reporting an advocacy team leader from your office. So what is the situation with that person? Will they return to the country, or are they still persona non grata? And secondly, if you can comment on the number of health facilities that were used in the conflict so far for abuses.
Sorry. Perhaps we'll start with the first question from ATS.
No, but I'm going to start with the questions then in certain order. Well, first of all, I have to say to your questions from AP that we did not come under pressure from the government, first of all. So while the report does not explicitly mention that Ethiopian and Eritrean forces were responsible for the majority of the violations, we do have a sufficient quantitative and qualitative picture of what happened during the period under review on the basis of information collected for the report to suggest that that was indeed the case. However, given the impossibility of gathering full information from all areas, it is impossible to put precise numbers on any category of violations or on the relative scale on which they were carried out by the various parties. On the issue of genocide, well, I think that in a number of cases there were disturbing suggestions of ethnically motivated violence, but the report did not have sufficient evidence to characterize more generally the extent of the nature of the ethnic-based crimes, but they clearly warrant further investigation. Whether an individual committed acts intentionally directed at the destruction of a specific ethnic group as such would be for the determination of a competent criminal court. So that's why the report does not go into that. This was a human rights investigation, not a criminal one. So as such, it doesn't make findings concerning the criminal responsibility of specific individuals. The approach we adopted was the reasonable ground to believe standards of proof that is lower than the standard required in criminal trials. But I would stress that this standard of proof is sufficiently high to legally require further investigations into the incident or pattern of conduct which could lead to criminal prosecution of the alleged perpetrators where there are sufficient indications of culpability. The joint investigation, as was explained by all of us, was meant to inform and possibly lead to other accountability processes. So where required, the information can be used for criminal proceedings. On the colleague. Yes, the colleague who was expelled from considered persona non grata, we have not yet received clear information of the reasons. It was mentioned in general that all the people who were PNG were meddling in domestic issues. We do not have any evidence that that happened with our colleague, and we have not received yet a clear information of the reasons of the colleagues being PNG. But until now, we have been said that the situation will not be restored. They got to remain outside Ethiopia. And so we are taking care of the colleague. I think we are totally free.
Thank you. Next question from Isabel Sacco of Spanish news agency EFE.
Yes, good morning. I would like to know what are the communication that you have had with, for example, the Eritrean government in regards to the presence of the Eritrean forces in Tigray. If they are, if you have asked them to withdraw their forces, or if they have proposed something regarding this. And also, I would like to know your perception of the conflict after all that you have seen and all the victims that you have interviewed and I suppose, the contacts that you have with the authorities and with also with the parties that are taking part in the hostilities. What are the prospects in some way of this conflict from your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel.
Just to go back to sort of the first line of questioning on the attributing blame for the worst offenses. The report does not seem to talk about some of the mass killings which have been reported and attributed to Eritrean state forces. Can you explain a little bit about this sort of omission? And do you think that the report, fairly, does it fairly lay out the proportion of violations committed by each side? Is there a fair representation? And then specifically on the and the lack of reports on the Eritrean state abuses. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you. You allude to concerns about the impartiality of the work of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. You must be aware that there are suggestions that it blocked some aspects of the investigation or reporting on some aspects. Could you comment whether that did occur, and if so, in relation to what issues? And secondly, could you also be quite clear, are you recommending now that the international community should set up an investigative mechanism? Thank you.
Well, on the engagement with the Ethiopian and Eritrean government, I think I have to say that the joint investigation team scheduled meeting with all parties to the conflict. Some parties responded while others did not. Parties were also given an opportunity during the investigation period to respond to queries in writing. The Ethiopian government in multiple occasions noted its commitment to receiving the report and recommendations on the joint investigation. So we sincerely hope that the government will be willing to implement the recommendations. But as of today, we have not yet received any official response from the state of Eritrea on the joint investigation team's request for a meeting or to the list of issues that transmitted to the embassy of the state of Eritrea in Addis Ababa. We have also not received any indication from the Eritrean government of openness to receive the findings and recommendations on the joint investigation, and we will continue to engage with the Eritrean authorities in this regard. In its response to the joint investigative team's request for a meeting, the TPLF indicated its readiness to facilitate an independent investigation. However, it expressed its opposition to the involvement of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in the investigation, and unfortunately has refused to meet us as a joint team. In the thing of the report, I think, presented the findings that we were able to I would say collect, talking to the different witnesses, with the victims. And if you read the report, you will see how many times the Eritrean forces are really shown as the main responsibles for many of the violations of human rights, being it individual or massive. The report is more a chronological narrative of what happened, intending what the objective that Merit said, that we were looking for the report. So you will see the huge, if I would say, responsibility of Eritrean soldiers and forces on that. on the question if we have asked them to withdraw, yes, we have done a lot of not in the joint report, where we have done it in our public statements. Since the beginning of the conflict, we have been calling for, of course, the end of hostilities and end of violence, an end of violations or abuses, and also we have been calling for the withdrawal of Eritrean forces. We have also mentioned that to the authorities, to the Ethiopian authorities, the need to ensure the withdrawal as soon as possible of the Eritrean forces, to insist to Eritrea on the need of those soldiers to go back home and stop the violence, and of course we have been calling in our recommendations to the Eritrean government also to make all the processes of investigation of all allegations and to hold perpetrators accountable. In terms of the perception of the conflict, what we have seen is that we continue having situations on the ground that are really complicated. We continue having we continue having airstrikes in the last recent shellings by the ENDF of Mekelle, and we have received that the federal forces in Mekelle and surrounding areas between the 18th and 22 of October. We have also established that during those 5 days, 3 different locations in or near Mekelle were shelled, causing the death to 3 children and injuring 15 other civilians. On the 18th of October, 3 boys aged 9, 12, and 14 were killed as they were looking after cattle by airstrikes on farmland in the Arejina, Kebele. It's like 15 kilometers from Mekelle. 8 other civilians, including a father of 2 of the deceased boys, were injured. In another incident, the same day, 7 civilians, 3 men, 4 women were injured by airstrikes near Adi High Market Center in Mekelle. And the Ethiopian government admitted responsibility for the 22 October airstrike that did not cause any casualties, but not the 18 October one that resulted in the killing of the 3 children. And it claimed that the airstrike targeted its former military base that was now training base and a battle hub of the TPLF in Mekelle. We also have received reports of advances by Tigrayan forces in the south wall zone of the Amara region. Ongoing fighting and hostilities in and around Desi and Kombolcha is understood to have resulted in large-scale displacement and increasing humanitarian needs. And as of 30th of October, fighting was reported in Desi. So fighting was also reporting in Kombolcha, which is close by. And electricity and telecommunications have reportedly been cut in Desi and Kombolcha since the 30th of October. We have also received some allegations from the governments of killing of youth in Kombolcha on Sunday and Monday, but we have not been able yet to verify that. But some of these things will come in the next press release that we will issue a little bit later. And on the questions of, and of course, we have been calling all parties to end hostilities and end all violations and abuses of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and refugee law. Well, call them to end all forms of violence against women, girls, boys, and men, to end all acts of torture and ill treatment, to ensure this is something very important because there has been difficulties on humanitarian access. So we've been calling to ensure humanitarian access to all parts of Tigray and also to affected areas of Amara and Afar. And we also think it's indeed necessary to ensure prompt, impartial, independent, credible, transparent domestic accountability processes and remedies, but failing those, consideration should be given to an international mechanism. So on the question of the New York Times, I think if you read the report, there are the facts, there are the victims, there are the witnesses. So I think we should focus on that. Of course, it is impartial. Of course, it has been developed by a methodology that our office has provided, has trained everyone. We have a long group of experts who participated there. not from the Office of Regional Office of Africa. We hire them specifically to do the job, forensics, people experts in gender-based violence, in girls, in children, so they could do a whole picture. So we believe that the methodology talks by itself, but the report talks by itself. And I will invite you all to focus on the report, on the terrible findings. And I can say it was done very seriously. And of course, we had the challenges and the obstacle that Mario was mentioning in terms of not having access everywhere. So that's why we say that probably more investigations should be needed when security possibilities permit. On the recommendation of the investigative mechanism, I think we are saying that in case that the Ethiopian government has mentioned that they have said, and the reports mentioned that already 14 or 16 people has been indicted as perpetrators of rape and violence against women, gender-based violence, and that 20 more are ongoing trials. But we have no information. That's why we said that we don't have enough transparency. We feel that there's a bigger scope of violation of human rights that needs to be investigated and needs to have all the criminal investigations and held perpetrator accountable. And if that doesn't happen, we think it will be needed an international mechanism. Probably there will be a special session on the Human Rights Council that they will ask me to brief them on this, and there might be some decisions and resolution in that moment. Sorry, I say intersessional briefing, intersessional session.
Thank you very much. Any more questions in the room? No. Peter Kenny of All Africa.
Thanks for taking my question. I'd just like to make an observation. First, that journalists generally prefer to be able to ask questions one at a time. They find that a more transparent method. I would like to ask Madam Sheriff if she could expand a bit on, she spoke about intimidation of UN investigators and the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights. Could you say who was doing the intimidation? Thank you.
Sorry, Lisa Shine of VOA.
Yes, good morning, and good morning, High Commissioner. I have a couple of questions for you. First, have you received an official response from the government, Ethiopian government, to your report, to your investigation? Then you indicated that the Eritrean government probably would not implement the recommendations that you have for that government. What about the Ethiopian government? Do you believe that it indeed will implement your recommendations, or do you see some hesitancy about that? Jamie indicated that there was already a response which didn't signify great cooperation on their part, if you could elaborate on that. And then lastly, the government may not be deliberately, I don't know, is the government blocking humanitarian aid, deliberately blocking aspects of humanitarian aid to the Tigrayan people? I know that some gets through, but all UN agencies consistently, I hear them all the time, and they're very upset they're not getting their aid through. So is this a deliberate policy, and is it a form of a weapon of war? Thank you.
Sorry, Nina Larson of AFP.
Yes, hi, thank you for taking my question. So I was wondering on the recommendation to possibly establish an international investigative mechanism, what you would like that mandate to be, and if it should include investigation into the allegations of genocide? Do you think that would be included in that mandate? And along the same lines as what Lisa was asking, what about the use of deliberate starvation as a weapon of war? Would that also be included? Thank you.
Well, on the report, information that we have is that intimidation to the joint investigation team was done mainly by regional security forces. That's the information. We don't have more detailed information. Did you have, Marit, more detailed information? Because
I mean, just to say that it was at military, also checkpoints and other issues, and sometimes the intimidation was more formal, informal, including, of course, by population sympathetic to one side or the other when the team was traveling. So that's what we would say. Could I just mention, there was a question earlier on health centers.
Okay.
And whilst we don't really have information about whether health centers were really used for violations or crimes as such, the report really documents, and I wanted to just draw attention to that, to the significant damage to many, many health centers, in Tigray in particular, due to shelling, due to looting and the inaccessibility. 52% of the health centers only remain functional. Only 40 out of 224 health centers in Tigray, and they're only in the bigger cities such as Mekelle, Shire, and Aksum, and on the main roads. And the team really documented significant damage to health centers from shelling, from looting, from the absence, and of course the absence of medical personnel. So that is a particularly difficult situation that we should, you can read about in the report. Thank you. High Commissioner, back to you.
Yes, on the question is we have received official response to the joint investigation. Well, as you know, when we prepare a report and even in a joint report, we send the report to the member state concerned. So we did send it to the Ethiopian government, and they gave us comments. We usually, but they also said that they want to speak publicly about it. So we did receive these comments officially from the government, and that so those had been analyzed and look at it if they were, because usually what we ask from governments is to see if some facts have any mistake. That's the kind of thing. But of course, we do not, and if they're real facts, it could be, introduce certain adjustment. In this case, it was more their interpretation of the issues and their interpretation of certain incidents. But we did receive a response. We did not receive any response on any, as I mentioned before, on the possibility of asking Eritrean or TLDF on that. On the question of denial of on Eritrea, the government will do we see if they're gonna really follow the recommendations? Well, they said in that official response that they will look at this and they will analyze this and will follow the recommendation. And we have been urging relevant parties to accept and act on our recommendations. OHCHR will also work on measures to, I would say, to support the government towards accountability and required reforms to ensure compliance. We'll also organize follow-up consultation with Ethiopian authorities and parties willing to engage with a view to unpacking the recommendations and following up with them on how best to support them in implementing the recommendations to bring about real accountability process. As I said before, I'm expected to update probably the Human Rights Council as a way of taking forward the outcome of the joint investigation. We'll consider briefing the Human Rights Council on the findings of the report during either an informal briefing or intersessional session on a variety of subjects, including Tigray. On the idea of on the question on denial of humanitarian access to humanitarian relief, yes, the conclusion that we have on this is that there were access restrictions, including multiple checkpoints by EDF and ENDF, which impeded or delayed the delivery of humanitarian assistance to part of Tigray and Amhara region. Tigray forces were implicated in setting up road blockades that resulted in delay of humanitarian relief as well. While the joint investigative team could not confirm deliberate or willful denial of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Tigray or to use the starvation as a weapon of war, we recognize it needs for further investigation on alleged violations related to denial of access to humanitarian relief and killings of humanitarian workers. And that was the conclusions during the report. But we have tried to get some new information from the colleagues of the humanitarian actors. And so what we have said that up to 7 million people in Tigray and Mara and Afar are now in need of food assistance and other emergency support. And this includes more than 5 million people in Tigray, where an estimated 400,000 are living in famine-like conditions, IPC 5, that means catastrophic level of food insecurity. And the spread of the conflict to neighboring Afar and Amara regions has caused large-scale population displacements and increased food insecurity and protection needs. But talking specifically to access, that was the question. Access restriction has drastically limited the entrance of life-saving humanitarian supplies into Tigray, as well as fuel, cash, and equipment needed to sustain operations. Since the 18th of October, no trucks with humanitarian supplies have arrived into Tigray. All convoys movement are on hold in Semera and Afar region pending authorization from the authorities. Since the 12th of July, only 15% of the trucks, that is 1,114 trucks needed, have entered the region. An estimated 100 trucks with food, non-food items, and fuel must enter Tigray daily to meet critical humanitarian needs. Fuel for the humanitarian response had not entered Tigray since early August, forcing partners to suspend or significantly reduce humanitarian programs. And since the 22nd of October, flights have been suspended following the incident with an humanitarian flight destined for Mekelle was aborted due to airstrikes. So this means that cash for the humanitarian operation cannot be transported any longer, and movement of aid personnel is restricted. And on the final questions of the inclusion of a recommendation, I think it's the moment we have urged the government to do their work, they follow the recommendations. They need now to show that they are really taking seriously those recommendations. They are really taking seriously the need for accountability and bringing perpetrators accountable. We will be monitoring that situation, and of course, it will be up to member states after we inform them to define if there's enough progress or if there is a need for a sooner international independent investigation. We do believe that there's a need for even domestic international independent investigations. In case that does not happen, we will be looking forward for an international independent mechanism.
Okay, Commissioner to leave shortly. I just will say the update on the situation since the 28th of June and the current situation in Ethiopia will go to you around 11 p.m. today, so in about 45 minutes. Perhaps we'll take one last question. Sorry, 11 a.m. There's one follow-up question I see from Lisa Schlein, so I think we'll take that as the last question. I don't see any other hands. So, Lisa?
Thanks, Rupert. Yeah, it's a follow-up on my first question to you, actually, about the response of the government to your report. Nobody likes to be criticized, individuals or people or whatever. But generally, what sense did you get? Did they accept your findings, or were they pretty much in denial or hostile to many of your findings and the accusations that you make in your report about their actions, or did they tend to justify, largely justify this conflict?
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. I was just trying to get, because last information from our colleagues from Addis, because the Prime Minister, I mean, in the response that we got, the comments, they did said that they're going to accept it. But the important thing is that the Prime Minister has just issued a statement saying that they accepted the report and they're going to follow the recommendations. And I think that's good news.
So thank you very much, High Commissioner. So I think we'll, Jamie, you want another question? All right, one very last question. This is Associated Press follow-up question.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I know that you mentioned the press release for the events since the 28th of June are going to be, but we're not going to get that on camera. So could you just sort of like lead into that? I think you meant 11 a.m., not 11 p.m.
A.m.
And just to be clear on this, because we've had a number of United Nations Human Rights Office reports on various situations, whether they be in Yemen or in Syria, and very often we get this sort of theme that both sides have committed abuses or violations or even atrocities in some cases. And I just want to make sure, if we can get very clearly from you, it looks like we're at another type of situation like that where there are, but a lot of people would like a bit more clarity on this, especially from you as as investigators. So can you give us really the takeaway that you have about which side you really believe may have, in your own words, off of the text that you had prepared, but in your own words, where does the responsibility really lie for these problems in Tigray? Thanks.
Well, first of all, I need to say that all parties are involved, because all parties need to stop doing it. First of all, that's the main thing. Secondly, of course, in the period during that the report was including in its analysis, I would say that my big numbers of violations of human rights are linked to the Ethiopian and Eritrean defense forces. But we have seen that since the cease of fire, there has been huge allegations of abuses by the Tigrayan forces, and continue until today. Unfortunately, we also see that all parties continue violating human rights until today. So that's why, having said that, we can see that different periods can show a little bit different trend. We need all parties to stop hostility, all parties to stop violence and violations of human rights. And we need everybody to take responsibility on this and do what they have to do. And that's why we are giving recommendations to all parties, especially, of course, on governments, because it's a state, their main responsibility always to ensure the protection. But here we do have non-state actors, but there are the military forces and militias that are violating human rights. They also need to be responsible and stop all the violations of human rights.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll end it there. And thank you all for attending and your attention to the report.